Good afternoon, everyone. The financial report this time will be relatively brief, but we'll go through some of the highlights of what's been done since the last meeting in April, some updated financial numbers for the year to date, and then we had some people who asked some questions about how our investment policies worked on the reserves, so we have a couple slides on that too. So, since April, a couple key filings have been done. The IRS 990 forms were prepared, reviewed, and filed on time as per our obligations. And we've been continuing to monitor all our investments with the investment policies. And as at the end of August, our investment balances were just a little over $30 million. Our financial results year to date are kind of where the board expected them to be. Registration revenue just shy of $12 million. Expenses just a little over $13 million. Tracking at a current deficit of $1.3 million. But when you take our investment results into account, there's a net to reserves of a little over $1 million. That will likely not still be the case by the time the end of the year rolls around, when the books close and we present to you next April, but it is the current picture as of the end of August. Quick chart here gives you a rough idea of our registration revenue year to date versus prior years. This is the typical. There's still several months to go, but as you can see, the ISP's revenue still continues to take up a large portion of our registration revenue. Our financial reserves, as most of you know, we have various different reserve funds. We have the legal defense fund, the operating reserve fund, and the long-term reserve fund, all of which have different purposes, and they also have different investment policies and procedures. But this slide here gives you a rough idea of the balances of those three funds as of August 31st. It's as per the note there, $2.5 million was withdrawn from the account in January to cover the projected deficit that the organization has been running for the last couple of years, actually, while we've been having an engineering surge on amongst some other things. This gives an overall view of where our investment financial reserve balances are compared to prior years. And this one here talks about some of the reserves and the investment guidelines. Again, this was prepared because there were some questions. Basically, the legal defense fund, the objectives of this fund is that we need to be fairly liquid with the fund. We always want to take care of preserving capital. And I'm having a hard time reading these slides. I think it's time for glasses.
I would note because
Oh, try them. Tell you the truth.
I would.
Yeah, that's not happening.
So, Bill, I would note, just because I also looked this up recently, the actual policies are also on our website if people want to have some nighttime snooze reading.
Well, there you go. As Paul said, it is on the website, but we did prepare some slides because we did have some questions last time. The guidelines are there. Admittedly, I'm having a hard time reading them from here, but. In a nutshell, we have certain types of funds and investments that we'll do for each of our funds, depending on what the stated objectives are of that particular fund. This slide depicts that for the Legal Defense Fund, which I'm only able to read because it's in bold. This one's a little bit better. The Operating Reserve Fund. Similar types of objectives for the fund. Obviously, we need to be liquid and preserve capital, but we have a little bit of a different mix in the type of allowed investments that we have in this fund. And then the long-term reserve fund is also an eye-buster for me that I can't read. But once again, this gives you a rough idea of the breakdowns of the types of investments that we make that go into our long-term reserve fund. And those are the numbers. That's it for me, unless anybody has any questions. Jason.
Jason, Jason Schiller, Google. I'm very happy with the IT surge. I'd like to see that continued and to become more permanent IT work done at ARIN. I noticed that there was a deficit because of that. If you have to increase fees, and even if that's only on the largest ISPs, I would happily support that to continue getting the IT support that we need. Also, if we can make this messiness with regard to community networks go away by reducing the fees for the triple extra small ISPs, if that has to be offset by some of the largest ISPs in fees, I would be happy to support that as well. It seems like the only reason why we have a carve out right now for community networks is to give them appropriate fee structures. And I think if we can get the fee structure for the triple extra small ISP and allow them to fall into that bucket with some policy changes, maybe that might be a good solution. I'd be willing to offset those fees as well.
Good input. Thank you very much. Kevin?
Kevin Bloomberg, The Wire. One comment to start, which is we have policy on end user and ISP mostly because of the fee structure. And one of the talks that we've had over the years is coming to equalization over time. Long term, it set the expectations a little more for end users to get things in line, and eventually things will converge. And our policy, because of that, will converge significantly, similar to what some of the other regions have done. So I hope that over time, the end user fees will go up nominally over time, more than inflation, but not zero increase, so that we can deal with that once and for all. Everybody should be able to SWIP, and it shouldn't be because of financial. So that's the first thing. The second was just more of a question. You have 30 plus million in your reserve, and I suspect that might not be enough, or it's just right, but it's close based on the size of the organization. If, and you're going to laugh at this, ARIN were to wind down tomorrow, what is its obligations, anticipated obligations to be able to do that? Because having that number there of your reserve fund and things like that doesn't really paint a picture of, oh, we'd have $10 million that we need to give to employees as a thank you for their 20 years of service, or whatever the case may be. I don't know. Not just one employee. Sorry, John.
Oh, can I have a second?
Winding down the organization?
It's
Something
certainly
about 20 years and giving out $10 million?
it is certainly something we keep, and we worry about that liabilities and rainy days. That's to agree, but yeah.
Yeah. So just for future, that would something
there
like
is the bylaws specify as to the articles on how we do a wind down, but we're not there yet, and we're not planning for one on the short term.
No, where I was just saying was I don't understand as a normal person, not the board or anything like that. Just an idea of where the target should be gives me a sense of where you are. So right now I have the one metric. The other metric of where you think you should be is a useful information.
Go ahead, John.
Okay. So a wind down is an interesting event, and I'm not sure it's something you can realistically know, because it's not, you don't have a circumstance where as of tomorrow you have a year's expenses and zero revenue and you suddenly have to offset that. Note, if we did have that, we'd be fine. We have a year's expenses even to operate and no revenue. What we have done is we have looked at the position of the organization over long term, 5 years out, how the expenses trend, how the revenues trend, and what the reserve will be. When our reserve was approaching 1.2, 1.3% of annual revenue, we had people come up to the microphone and say, spend more money on engineering, get rid of the backlog. We are now at the point where the revenue is about 1 year's expense approximately equals the reserve. We're in about the same category. We have a little bit more because if you, even if you take out the legal and other, our reserves are still pretty high. But they're going to trend down over the next few years. We're slightly over operating expense to current revenue, so the reserves are going to come down. The board's talked about whether or not we want the reserves to be at 1 year operating expense, a year and a half's operating expense. I don't think we want to go too high, but I also don't think we want to go too low. But there's no scenario we could realistically plan for. The wind down one doesn't make sense. What makes sense is a sudden drop or a sudden precipitous change where we have to go a number of years with much less revenue. And we're set for that.
Just to answer your question, the current policy is 1 year.
Thank you.
That's in the document itself.
Thank you.
Chris?
Hi, Chris Woodfield, Salesforce ARIN AC. Has there been any work to track changes in revenue as a result of legacy space coming under a new RSA agreement via transfers?
There has. John can speak to that.
Oh, there's an interesting bimodal thing going on. I could tell you that what was 54% of the address space was legacy, and now it's down to 40-something because a lot of it has come under RSA. But that's actually not the right math, because at the same time, a lot of it has left to another region because it transfers into RIR, which means the denominator's changing at the same time. So we have some dual action factors that we've tried to model and look at. We do have resources coming into RSA, which ends up generating revenue. They end up being registration services providers, but we also have resources leaving at the same time. As I said, we did a 5-year revenue model, kind of did an outlook of those. There is some compression in revenue. ARIN can probably expect under the current model a 10% compression in revenue. That brings us down under operating costs, and if you take the difference and compound it over 5 years, you begin to take down the reserves. We intend to be break even, and so one of the things we're looking at based on the 5-year model is fine tweaking so that our costs and our revenues match. But because we have revenues increasing with things coming legacy to RSA, but also leaving as resources both under RSA are transferring out, it's a net neutral effect.
Okay, thank you.
Owen?
Owen DeWong, Akamai ARIN AC. I'm responding to Kevin's comment about swipping being related to finance. I thought we discussed in New Orleans that end users are perfectly capable of submitting SWIPs and ARIN will process them. And am I remembering that wrong, or is there actually no barrier to swipping whatsoever as things currently stand? And so that is kind of...
So one of the things that we did is we drafted a set of harmonized service terms. Because when we did the fee schedule, we got the fees very close. There's a fairly linear scale all the way down, particularly if you go and look, the bottom fees for ISPs begin to resemble the end user fee categories for about the same amount. We thought about trying to do a harmonized service plan. We have not yet actually come out and gone to the community and said, what do you want to have happen here with respect to redelegation services? So we do have a number of organizations that are doing redelegation and are not ISPs. We tell people that we're going to come up with a common plan for this and get it signed off by the community. Some people believe that all of our redelegation services, SWIP and ARHU should only be available to ISPs or people under a registration services plan. Some people believe it should be available to everyone. There's some implications to this financially that we need to work through, and we need to put a plan in front of the community. Right now, there are some small number of users who have historically been doing SWIP who continue to do so. We tell everyone redelegation is a function of a registration services plan, though. Answer your question?
Not entirely.
Right. If you were doing SWIP, if you are doing SWIP and you have been doing SWIP, you can continue to do so. If you ask us, we will tell you services of redelegation are for ISPs under registration services plan.
So if an end user that hasn't previously done SWIP submits one, you'll reject it?
I do not believe we will process it, but I will check for you. How's that?
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Any other questions for Bill?
Thank you.